Welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. Today's episode considers Attentat 1942, developed and published by Charles University and the Czech Academy of Sciences. Attentat is a point-and-click adventure game in which you conduct interviews with family members and their acquaintances to discover why your grandfather was arrested by the Gestapo during the Second World War. Along the way, you learn about the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, the role of collaborators in that occupation, and the resistance to that occupation, including the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich by Czech and Slovak partisans. Returning to History Respawn to discuss this game is Dr. Zachary Doleshal. Zach is a clinical assistant professor at Sam Houston State University. His book, entitled In the Kingdom of Shoes, will be published later this year by the University of Toronto Press. Zach, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Bob. It's a pleasure to be back on this awesome podcast.
So today we're talking about a time period in Attentat 1942 that's right in your wheelhouse. I know that you're an expert on modern Czech history. I know that you teach classes on the Second World War and the Holocaust. And we've got the game paused right now. So I thought maybe we could use some of this time to let you give us a brief background on the occupation of Czechoslovakia. And then also, maybe as we go along, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in 1942.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll make it as brief as possible. As you said, I've spent a great deal of my time studying this period in this place. But I think what is an interesting starting point is to think about how Czechoslovakia was a mini Austro-Hungarian empire, in that it was a multi-ethnic state that tried its best to provide a kind of representational democratic government for its peoples. And now it didn't always get that right, but it was, because of this kind of situation, fairly vulnerable to the irredentist movements of German nationalists. There were about 3.5 million German-speaking people in Czechoslovakia. And of course, people of the far right in Germany, they believed that those people belonged to the German state. And the many people within Czechoslovakia who considered themselves German nationalists agreed. And so that created a volatility to the state that really would not be resolved until after World War II, and its resolution was quite tragic. The Nazi state looked to Czechoslovakia as this sort of opportunity. And when I say opportunity, it was an opportunity to expand its borders, to show German people just how successful the Nazi foreign policy could be by sort of absorbing these Czechoslovak Germans. What that meant was, of course, Czechoslovakia was very much a target of the Third Reich, and tried very hard to strengthen its alliances across Europe, most importantly with France. Now, what happens, of course, is the famous Munich Agreement of 1938. And just very briefly, what happened in Munich was that the Allies, the great powers, sort of go to the table with Nazi Germany in the hopes to avoid war. And by so doing, they give away most of the territory in Czechoslovakia that was German-speaking majority areas, the Sudetenland. And so after October 1938, Czechoslovakia is a rump state, and it has lost its defensible borders. It is very vulnerable. And then in March 39, the Germans move in and occupy the rest of it. Slovakia becomes a puppet state, and Bohemia and Moravia, the two sort of historic provinces of the crown lands of Bohemia, they are now put under this government called the Protectorate, and the Protectorate is really a kind of military dictatorship style of government, even though there is this very weird kind of duality to it. I won't go into that too much, but so you could say the buck, the full power is really in Nazi party members who are appointed to this position of Reichsprotectorate, Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and that goes to Reinhard Heydrich, who is, well, the quintessential Nazi. Maybe we'll stop there. I could go into more about why he is
I'm wondering,
the quintessential Nazi.
Yeah, just to interrupt you just real fast. There is this wonderful encyclopedia that comes along with the game, and this is the very beginning of the game, and the encyclopedia kind of fills you in on some of these details, and a lot of these are written by historians in the Czech Republic, so they're really pretty authoritative. But one of the things that I think this game does pretty well of getting across is what a despicable character Reinhard Heydrich actually was. And Zach, I'm wondering, I mean, in the list of people that you think as a historian that may have been the most evil people in world history, I mean, he's got to rate in the top 10 at the very least.
Yeah, he's certainly up there. And really, why you would, I mean, I don't like to rank people based on how evil they are, but just to play along, why you could put him up in the top 10 is because he was so good and cool and level-headed at what he was doing. He was incredibly effective at getting the notoriously fractious, not high-ranking Nazi Party officials to agree on things, and that's hard to do. One of the big myths is that the Nazi sort of government worked very smoothly. It was sort of a well-oiled machine. It was not. It had lots of little pockets of authority, and rarely did these guys get along with each other. But Heydrich was able to, through a variety of tactics, get the high-ranking Nazi authorities to really work in unison. And what he was able to get them to do, of course, is to plan, coordinate, and organize the Holocaust. January 1942 is the date of the Wannsee Conference, which is this conference that happens outside of Berlin, where top-ranking Nazi Party officials they gather in a villa of a German Jew who they requisition this beautiful house, and during the course of that conference, Heydrich is the organizer of this conference. It is essentially decided and planned out how 6 million people will be murdered. So yeah, he's in the top 10. He's in the top 10, and I think that's why his assassination is so sensational and interesting, because it's one of those assassinations. It's pretty clear cut, right? And yeah.
All right. Well, let's jump into the game. Let's talk to the kind of narrative conceit of this game is that it's 2001 in Prague, and so you're living in an era when many of the people who lived through the Second World War would still be alive. Now, of course, 2020, that's kind of increasingly unlikely. But here we've got your character and your grandmother, and you're going to go and help her move out of her house in Prague. And during the course of that, you're going to come along the subject of your grandfather in his story during the Second World War. So the game is a point and click adventure, and you've got these kind of FMV sequences with actors portraying the characters in the game. And this wonderful antique radio. I couldn't imagine anybody saying we should throw this thing out. That's horrific.
Yeah, as historians, what?
So now we get to flashback sequence of May 1942. And in these flashback sequences, we get these great kind of comic book, graphic novel depictions of the past history. And I don't know what you think of these, but I think they're fantastic.
Yeah, they look beautiful.
We get this nosy neighbor who comes back again in a later sequence in the game. I don't want to give too much away to people who haven't played this already. So here we get a mention of Heydrich and the assassination. And if memory serves me correctly, they attempted to kill him at the end of May, but he didn't end up dying until early June.
Right. That's right. And he dies of an infection by way of the stuffing of the car. So the operation that kills them, they do it with bombs, and a bomb goes off on the side of his car, and it sort of blows in the stuffing into his wounds, and that is what actually does him in.
So here off screen, we've got the grandfather talking, and they kind of already sense the implications of what's going to happen to Czechoslovakia as a result of this event. And now we've got the Gestapo showing up. So we've got a sequence here that is kind of a sort of a mini game that the game presents to you, in which we've got to hide some leaflets. Now, we don't get a sense of this right now as to what these leaflets actually are, but later on we discover that these leaflets are actually carrying German anti-Nazi messages with them. So if the Gestapo were to find these at the house, then it could be very bad for the grandparents here. So now we've got to decide where the grandmother is going to hide these leaflets. So we've got to choose a spot, and you could get this wrong. So, Zach, I'm going to leave it up to you. Where do you think we should hide these leaflets?
Oh, it's up to me. You could just click on anywhere in the apartment.
Just
there?
About like anything interactive, like the stove, the closet, under the bed.
I think the stove looks pretty good.
Let's go for that.
Yeah. Oh, I would not do good in the resistance.
Hey, guess what? They didn't find it.
They didn't find it though, so yeah.
So this, I mean, this really would have, this sequence here, this would have been really horrific to go through, especially just after you found out that Heydrich had, the assassination had gone off. And I'm wondering if you could tell the listeners a bit about what was the German response to the assassination and what happened as a result of this to the occupation of Czechoslovakia.
Okay. Well, you've heard the expression "kicking the hornet's nest." This certainly would meet that. What really goes on after the assassination of Heydrich is a combination of uncertainty among the Nazi leadership and the Protectorate, and acting out of a kind of a fear that this is going to, spread. There uncertainty in that for a good while they can't find the assassins,
Yeah.
and there's a great deal of misinformation out there, and so they cast a wide net. And then, acting from fear, there's a considerable amount of brutality that comes along with it. Now, this is not specific to the occupation of Bohemian Moravia. There is especially dealing with the Slavic populations. This isn't necessarily the case in France, for example, in that occupation, but in Poland. And then after the assassination of Heydrich, it's really applied to the Czech populace as well. That if any of the Germans are taken out, there will be very large reprisals against both targeted and random victims. So what the Nazi authorities do is well, it's a war crime. They go and based off of some of this misinformation, they go into a small village in the northwest of Prague, where they think the parachutists, these were the men who assassinated Reinhard Heydrich. They were trained by special operations in England. These were sort of Czechoslovak government and exile soldiers, and they were given this very highly secretive special mission. They were parachuted into the country. They were helped by the local resistance, the democratic local resistance, which is an important. There are kind of two resistance networks: one communist, one sort of, you could say, democratic. One leaning towards Moscow, one London. Anyway, so they're helped, but the Nazis don't really know who helped them or where, and they get this bad information that a farmer in Lidice, this small little village, helped them. So they go into this village of about 200 or so, and they murder everyone. All of the men are killed. All of the children are rounded up, and they're placed in foster homes, German-speaking foster homes. The earth is upturned, every single building demolished.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of complete destruction of this small little town, and as I said, that it's part of this confusion that reigns among the sort of Nazi leadership. They just don't know really about the network. They will come to find it only when a man who had been working with these parachutistas, as they're called, the parachuters, a guy by the name of Karel Čurda. And Čurda today, for people with long memories, now it's not so much used, but it used to be used all the time. It meant traitor. It was a synonym for traitor. If you say somebody, is a Čurda, they're referring to Karel Čurda, this member of this team who then he cracked under the pressure. And what was the pressure? Well, it was intense, right? There were daily announcements on the radio of prisoners who were executed and they would just sort of list these political prisoners who the Gestapo had killed that day. Sometimes there were only a few, sometimes there were 50 or more, and they would just read these names over the radio. They would post them all over Prague. It was an intense sort of form of psychological warfare designed to crack anyone who knew about this very well organized assassination attempt, and ultimately Churda cracked, and he told the authorities where to find these assassins.
Mm.
But yeah, the response was a war crime, and it was. It left to Lidice being razed, and then there was another smaller town yet, smaller village named Lejaki, where they did the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah. So what do we got now? What is
one of these great things is that this game intersperses the kind of oral history interviews that you're doing with your family members and others with actual archival video footage of what's going on. And so she's talking a bit about the black market, assuming that perhaps your grandfather had something to do with that, and that maybe is why the Gestapo was coming by. And now I'm going to go kind of direct and see if he had anything to do with the assassination attempt on Heydrich.
Yeah, and I would kind of add to this story. There's a lot to unpack just at the very beginning, historically speaking. For example, listening to a radio playing jazz. These were both things that could get you arrested and get you in trouble. And in fact, there was a whole network of people working for the democratic resistance. They, of course, had nothing to do with the assassination of Heydrich, but their main task was to kind of smuggle and move these radios around so people could listen to the BBC to listen to the Western Allies broadcasts. And when caught, they would end up in jail. It was rough. And what is this?
Well, in that kind of environment, any sort of nonconformist activity could be interpreted as resistance, as attempting to overthrow the regime. And yeah, I could see where communications where radios would fall into that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was a big deal. Those radios.
So now we get our first historical document, your grandfather's journal from time period before, and we get the chance to decrypt this diary. So what we've got here is what looks to be a substitution cipher. So what we do is we move these parts down until it begins to look like plain English.
Oh, yeah. That's fun.
So now we've got kind of the word yesterday, and that's what I'm looking for here. So I'm going to see if that fits. And there it is. I should mention to our listeners that I teach classes on historical cryptography. So I hope I'm pretty good at that.
It took you 5 seconds.
So here we've got some of his day-to-day life mentioned here. And, like I said, this is a game produced by Charles University, along with other academic groups, historians at Charles University heavily involved in the making of this game. So it says at the beginning of the game that this is kind of a fictionalized story, but it's based on actual historical records. So we could imagine that even though this is not a real journal, that it's one that would maybe fit in with the wider context of the era.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And yeah, I could just see in this is right before the mobilization of the Czechoslovak army.
Mm-hmm.
1938 was very tense for the people of Czechoslovakia. It seemed like war was going to happen at any moment. And there were several sort of start and stop mobilizations. But then once they were kind of sold out, the Czechoslovak government was sold out in 38 at the Munich Agreement. It was over, and
Mm-hmm.
no fighting happened.
So here we got more mention of the mobilization. And then we move into September and mobilizing for war. Basic training. And then here, humiliation.
Yeah.
Discharge from volunteer service. And so this is after Czechoslovakia has basically been sold out. And here we are in 39 with life going on, but in the midst of this kind of German domination.
Mm. Mm.
And so this goes through 1940, going through.
Oh yeah, if you go back to that last one let's see, maybe one more back. Yeah, this mentions the closure of the universities. And this was a big moment in the memory of those that lived through the occupation. University students protested the German occupation. They sort of, this was coinciding with Czech Independence Day, Czechoslovak Independence Day. And as punishment for their protest, the universities were closed and they would not reopen until after the war. So you can see they hit all the highlights really of the occupation here.
And I think it's effective too. I mean, if you're coming at this without knowing the history, its particular history of the Czech occupation during the war, then I think it's really effective to give you this kind of contextual information through the guise of a journal or a diary, rather than having you read through a bunch of text like in an encyclopedia. They do have an encyclopedia as part of the game, but as far as like the natural flow of the game, you get to go through it and read it from a first person perspective, from somebody you can empathize with, you can relate to, rather than as a static secondary, piece of literature written by a historian.
Yeah.
And here he is in 41, getting married. There's the apartment. And then a continuation going into 42. And then that's where things are left off. This is his last entry.
And that's a very very clever on the part of the writers of this game to use this picture there that he kind of lampooned is Emanuel Moravec, who was really the kind of the army chief of staff before the war, who then becomes a well-known collaborator with the occupational government. And so to use him, I've seen, they have a picture of him during mobilization. He was everywhere, inspiring people to fight back against the Germans. And now, in 40, 41, or where's 42, wherever we are in time, he had become kind of a face of collaboration for
Mhm.
many in the resistance. That's really clever to have that. Oh.
So here we go through the rest of 42.
Mm.
And then we get some mention here of issues related to the Holocaust, the identification of Jews by the Nazi state, by the Nazi occupation. And this is a major part of the story and the kind of central mystery of the story. So I don't want to go too much into that, but it does deal with many different elements of the occupation, related to resistance, related to collaboration, but then also has a solid section on issues related to the Holocaust in Czechoslovakia. And I think it's rare, even for World War II games, it's rare to see them attempt to deal with the Holocaust in any way. So I think this is something that is important, is worthwhile, and I think it's makes this game better for it, to be honest.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight. Why do you think World War II games avoid the Holocaust
I
so
think a lot of
carefully?
it has to do with the fact that these are games that are pitched at um, audiences who are living in primarily Western Europe, North America. There's a fear, I think, of stepping on any historical toes, so to speak,
Mm.
portraying certain groups in a negative light. Um, and also, I think that the Holocaust is seen as something that can be dealt with effectively, say, in a film or a documentary. But there's a concern, I think, with video games and their preference for violent and bombastic content that the Holocaust doesn't really fit into that at all. A lot of these games are about empowerment and making the player feel good.
Yeah,
And topics like the Holocaust don't really do that.
yeah.
But as a historian, it really concerns me that if we are going to start thinking about video games in a serious manner and seeing video games as the kind of vehicle for historical memory going forward into the 21st century, that we need to include difficult topics in those games. Um, but the problem, I think, is, from a developer, from a publisher standpoint, do those difficult topics sell?
Mm.
And I'm
Are they
not sure.
fun?
I'm
Are
not
they
sure they.
fun?
Yeah, would
Yeah.
they be fun? Yeah.
Can you play through a scenario or even just a scene
Hmm.
of the Holocaust and have fun? Right?
Yeah.
No, hopefully no. Right? I mean, I guess there's the kind of Schadenfreude of a game that might be more like Inglorious Bastards, I
Yeah.
guess.
A
But
historical wish fulfillment.
right, yeah.
And I think, the Wolfenstein series, published by Bethesda and developed by id, is a series that does that. It gives you that
Mm.
historical wish fulfillment, but um, at the same time, I think it's worthwhile to have serious games that relay serious history, and I think that this is a game that manages to do that while also being fun. I think, especially if you're into the history of cryptography.
Mm.
So let's just to kind of wrap things up, and so we can move things along. I'm going to jump out of this game here, and I am going to go into another save. Let's see if I can get to it. And this is one that picks up the game at a later point. So here we're in the midst of a later introduction with another character, doing another one of these oral history interviews. But I thought it might be worthwhile while we're here to come and take a look at the ways in which the encyclopedia expands through the later part of the
Oh,
game.
yeah.
And so here you've got a whole bunch of other topics that are dealt with. You've got a section here on the Munich Conference, which is discussed in detail. And I think one of the great things about this is that you've got the opportunity here to give even more historical background, more context to the player, but you don't necessarily force them to read this, right? So you have to exit the game and then go into the menu in order to find this. And I think that's a bit more effective than kind of heavy-handedly forcing the character or the player to read all of this information. I don't know what you think.
No, I agree. I think when you're trying to do something like this, it's got to be a very difficult balance. Clearly, this is meant to educate as much as it is meant to entertain, probably more so to educate. But you want to engage. You want to make it an active form of learning. And reading a kind of encyclopedia entry is not that active.
Yeah.
And so I agree. I think this is a very clever way to kind of balance that. And people that want to dig deeper, well, here you go.
Yeah.
And then hopefully from here, I am curious though, do they offer a kind of bibliography? Do they offer kind of places to go to find sources or anything?
You know,
Or
I
is it?
don't, and I don't see that. And I think there are some mention of sources here. Some of the newspapers, for instance, there's also the source National Film Archive, which I think is where they get a lot of the video information. But
Yeah, those are
you know,
all
there's not
primary
there's
sources.
not a there's not a kind of a guide, a bibliography, I think, to secondary readings, which I think is unfortunate. But still, I think it's from my perspective, it's always good to put the primary sources in front of the students. And I think the fact that you've got the secondary material here written by historians, it does quite a bit, even though maybe it leaves them perhaps with more questions. But maybe that's a good thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I would say so, and I think it's oh yeah, Battle for Czech Radio, a great story there. The beginning of the end of the German occupation. But this is, yeah, no, I think this is a wonderful teaching tool just from what, little I've seen. Yeah.
And so here you've got mention of Auschwitz, and then some mention here of other sources, Primo Levi, Spielberg, and then graphic mouse. Yeah, so it's something. One of the things that I did want to talk to you about was related to collaboration.
Yeah.
That's something that comes up with print media in the Protectorate. So it talks here about 2,000 newspapers, and then by the end, you've got 470 periodicals have ceased publication. So you've got the Germans kind of cracking down on communications, like you'd mentioned with the radio. And one of the interesting things this game does with regards to collaboration is it gives you a character to interview at near the end of the game. I don't want to give too much away, but he worked for a newspaper. And he talks a little bit about how he used his position, or attempted to use his position, to not necessarily help the Germans, but instead to help the Czech people. So finding ways to send coded messages and to attempt to convince the Czech to avoid violent resistance, like in the form of murdering Reinhard Heydrich, primarily because he worried that those kind of ostentatious attacks would lead to reprisals, like you mentioned with the sacking of these two towns and the murder of everybody there. So I'm wondering, because this game, it kind of pushes back on the traditional narrative of collaboration. It's not cut and dry, but there's a lot of kind of levels of gray within the portrayal of wartime life. And I'm just curious, as a historian of the modern Czech Republic, what do you make of this kind of attempt? What do you make of this approach? Does it feel accurate to the Czech experience of the Second World War?
So I think that hearing you describe where they were or where they have gone with collaboration and resistance makes me feel very good about this game indeed, because it absolutely existed in a gray area. Of course, Primo Levi, who we just kind of saw a reference to him, wrote one of the more influential pieces about this, the gray zone of between collaboration and resistance. And yeah, many people who were involved in the resistance or a kind of resistance in the Czech lands were not at all in favor of the decision to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they cabled back to the government in exile. The few of them who found out, the plan. Don't do this. This is a bad idea. We don't want this to happen. And of course, the reason being the reprisals would be severe, and they thought it would dramatically weaken and undermine their networks, and it did. Those sort of widespread dragnet operations that happened that it sounds like one of these characters got caught up in.
Mm-hmm.
Those were real, and they had very long-lasting effects. And when I say very long-lasting, what I mean is the people who really got caught in the dragnet operations after Heydrich were these democratic-minded resistance members. These were the people that were looking towards London. These were the government in exile folks. So the communist resistance was largely left untouched in this, and they emerged as the stronger group.
Mm-hmm.
So when 45 came around, it was the communists who were in a much more advantageous position. And many of the more kind of outspoken, outstanding lights of the democratic resistance had been liquidated, so to speak, right? They had been murdered or just sort of humbled, if you will, into passivity. And so that had a very long-lasting effect. Now, it also, of course, had some good. We could talk about the merits of Heydrich assassination, but your question was really more about that gray area. And it is an incredibly good question. A lot of people in the Czech lands kept working. They kept their jobs. For listeners who might not be that familiar with this area of the world, Bohemia and Moravia were among the most industrialized regions of Europe. Bohemia was the most industrialized region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, and it had outstanding industries that fell into the hands of Nazi Germany, giving really the Nazis the military and sort of economic capabilities to launch this much larger, kind of war and mission. But so there were jobs there, and the Nazis wanted these Czechs to work. They needed them desperately to work,
Mm-hmm.
and so wages went up for Czechs during World War II, and the birth rate went up. There were more Czechs at the end of World War II than there were before World War II. So this is a very interesting idea when we start thinking about, outcomes of collaboration and resistance. I mean, the Czech community in 1938, 39, numbered around 8 or 9 million people. So this is a small nation. But what do you do when you're occupied? Do you kind of make these dramatic acts of defiance, or do you kind of put your head down and get along, all the while hoping and waiting for your moment?
Yeah.
Right? Your moment. And most Czechs chose that path, especially after witnessing the outcome of the Heydrich assassination. They just kind of put their head down and waited. Now, is that collaboration? it's hard. It's hard for me to, of course, say that it is, or to judge those people at all. And then you also have instances where people sort of ratted out their neighbors, to
Yeah.
use that very unpleasant word, saying, "Oh, well, this person has leaflets, or this person's listening to the BBC, or this person is a member of the Communist Party, or what have you, or this person is Jewish, or is hiding a Jew, or something like this." All of that happens as well, which is not that hard to then use that word of collaborator, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you go out of your way to benefit yourself by turning in your neighbor, well, I'm sorry, but I think it's our duty as historians, and as humans, to call you out, and use that very ugly word of collaborator. But overall, people were faced with very difficult decisions, and they by and large made the tough decision to sort of put their heads down,
Yeah.
and not sort of speak out, and not fight the systems very much, and to sort of just get through it. And again, that strategy, if you're a Czech nationalist, it worked. It worked quite well.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what happens at the end of the war is this sort of collective revenge against the German inhabitants of Bohemia and Moravia, where 2.5 million Germans who have long family lines in that area are exiled. They're expelled, forcibly expelled. And I bet if you click on Sudeten-Germans,
Yeah.
you'll probably find that at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a very interesting way, in all of the nations, occupied nations. The Czechs are maybe the most successful in a way of surviving the occupation, because not
Mm-hmm.
only did they grow in numbers and their wages went up, but they sort of totally. I mean, again, a lot of Czechs today look at these expulsions as a tragedy, but then they didn't. They were very popular, and so if you're a hardcore Czech nationalist, you waited till you had your turn, and then you kicked out all of the Germans.
Right.
A total clean, kind of cleaning of the house, if you will. That leads us to another very interesting sort of observation with collaboration and resistance. What was that crime? The Czech expulsion of the German people of Bohemia. This too was a war crime,
Yeah.
and a very, very tragic episode. Who collaborated with that,
Yeah.
right? And who resisted it? And you get into very similar sort of categories of analysis there: collaboration, resistance. And these people who you could say, okay, this was clearly somebody who resisted the Nazis, then collaborated with the expulsion of a whole town
Yeah.
of German-speaking civilians of Bohemia. Just to give you a little bit of the complexity of this.
Yeah. It's incredible, and I think it's amazing, and that this game includes so many of those different topics. Especially because it's a game that's only a few hours long. This is a game that I played through in one sitting, and yet you've got a whole host of topics that are dealt with. And again, I for the viewer, for the listener, we're not playing through too much of this game, because I feel like playing through too much of a 3-hour game would kind of give it away, give away the central mystery. But
Yeah.
you can see in this kind of near end game encyclopedia the range of topics that they go through, and how much depth they give to those topics. There's stuff about the Sudeten Germans. There's stuff about repatriation. There is articles about the Holocaust, about the SS, the Gestapo, mobilization in 1938. and one of my favorite ones is a historian of empire and imperialism, is this idea of different types of resistance and how they make space for kind of nonviolent forms of resistance. And I think that's kind of one of the central points of this game, is that when you're faced with overwhelming enemy, one that can destroy you in so many different ways, one that can destroy whole towns and cities in the blink of an eye, then the forms of resistance that are available to you are limited, and violent resistance can lead to even more devastation on your people. And it really brings home the idea that kind of survival is a form of resistance, that survival is victory in these circumstances.
Absolutely. And I think among Holocaust survivors, that's the number one way that they got back. You hear this in survivor testimony over and over and over again. Um, we won because we are here.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really matter how they survived. That it was, what mattered was surviving. When you're facing a group, an enemy that has dehumanized you to that point, and wants to eradicate you, and make your culture into a historical memory,
Yeah.
That is resistance.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of Czechs thought of it the same way, although you cannot, and this is a really important point, you cannot sort of equate the overall Czech experience of World War II to what Jewish people
Yes.
experienced. These were fundamentally different experiences. In terms of a Central European group that went through the war, the Czechs were quite privileged. You could even make the argument, even over the Germans themselves, who had to go and fight on the Eastern and Western fronts.
Mm-hmm.
The Czechs, because they were not considered reliable, for good reason, by the Germans, they were not put into military service, right? So this was quite interesting, right?
Yeah.
But that's great revenge. Living well can be great revenge. Yeah, absolutely. But of course, after the war, what happens with this sort of the gray area of resistance is it's flattened out, and the communist period that begins in 48, but really even when Benes comes back in the office in 45, a narrative is crafted and clung to of these sort of heroic, militarily sort of minded and organized resistance groups, and they are celebrated, and the kind of gray area is just not accepted as a legitimate way of getting through it. Instead, there's kind of a narrative, and when the communists come to power, that narrative becomes even clearer, and that is the Communist Party working through unprecedented oppression, was able to create and support this vast underground network that, when the time came, rose up and did their sort of, what's the right word? They obtained their goal in
Mm-hmm.
destroying the Germans and reclaiming the honor of the Czech people. And so that these kinds of resistance cells are written about, left and right, but that everyday world of the war isn't talked about much, especially in a sort of official histories.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, writers, really excellent writers, especially those that go into exile, like Josef Skvoretsky, who becomes a really well-known writer in the English language, he writes a fantastic book called Cowards. It's translated into English, but it's originally in Czech, and it's about how Czech people didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to do with this occupation. They weren't heroes. A lot of them were cowards. And he himself is included in this. And his book is wonderful because it's this great duality of brave moments of defiance and cowardly moments of compliance. So that's really what a much more accurate portrayal. And if this game can get at that, well, that's quite a success.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the biggest bullet point for me about this game is the way in which it makes the issue of collaboration something that is more nuanced than you typically see, definitely in games, but just in wider culture in general related to the memory of the Second World War. And, I think the process that you're talking about in the Czech Republic about remembering this time period and the problems of only seeing it as resistance, and kind of valorizing violent resistance. It's a problem that is shared by many countries. You think about modern France, for instance, and if you were to read, especially French books, histories that came out shortly after the Second World War, you would think that everybody was a member of the resistance.
Right.
That's just not the case.
Quite the opposite, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We've gone an hour. What do you think? I think we should probably stop now.
Yeah, if the game itself is only 3 hours, I think that's probably good.
Well, that does it for this episode of History Respawn. Zach, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure as always, Bob.
If you enjoyed this episode of History Respawn, please check us out online at www.historyrespawn.com. And if you feel like supporting the show, please visit our page on Patreon at www.patreon.com/History Respawn. Until next time, goodbye.